If you want to get rich, you have to own property. And so Bitcoin is property that the middle class and working class people can own everywhere in the world. And otherwise, they're going to be destitute. So Bitcoin is a solution to the individual and the corporation. I think that it's idealistic to think that somehow all of the world's problems get solved in the next decade with Bitcoin. That's not true. But what is true is that if you're about to become poor and starve to death in the middle of a country where the currency is collapsing, it'll solve your problem. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the passion for Bitcoin starts from the premise that the money in the world is broken, that the fiat system is a distortion of reality, which is cruel and brutal to the working class, the middle class, and anyone who is not politically wired to take advantage of the system. So I would also make the observation that, you know, most of the statistics from the government, you know, that purport to measure the GDP or the inflation rate or the unemployment rate, they're warped. And so a lot of economics today is all revolving around getting you to accept a warped metric and then continuing to warp it such you come to the wrong conclusion.
Right.
And this graph is a classic example. This is the official, you know, Federal Reserve published graph showing the debasement of the dollar over 100 years. And if you took it at face value, what it says is that $26 is worth $1 today, and you lost 96% of your purchasing power. If you're measuring a market basket of highly manufactured products like boxes of potato chips, or, you know, Netflix streaming videos, things that, you know, come out of factories, then you're not going to see the same inflation. The implication of that graph is that inflation was 3% for 100 years. Mm-hmm. But by the way, the official target is 2%. The implication of the graph is 3%. Okay, that means you lost 99.8% of the value of the dollar in 100 years, and in 92 years. Right. And that implies 7% inflation a year. So what's this got to do with Bitcoin? Well, there's another chart, or another one I gave you, which is even more blood-curdling, which is, I remember the Argentine peso being 1 peso to the dollar 22 years ago. Right now, the blue dollar rate is about 320 pesos to the dollar. You work through the math, and what you find out is that the inflation rate, the inflation rate of the peso versus the dollar is about 21 to 24% per year, 20 years running. Okay, which means that whereas in the U.S. we've been cutting the value of your money in half every decade, in Argentina they're cutting the value of the money in half, or the currency in half, every 3 to 4 years. That's a 24% loss per year against the dollar, and the dollar is 7% against scarce assets. And so that leaves us with the question of, well, what's the solution? Okay, and George, to be clear, I agree that this is a probabilistic assessment when you live in the US and you have to choose between gold, S&P indexes, real estate in Florida, and other derivatives and other contracts, and Apple stock. It's a probabilistic thing, and you got to have a portfolio of you. But the interest rate in Argentina right now is 49% overnight. And the official inflation rate is probably 60, and the unofficial inflation rate is 80. And so you have a different view toward probabilistic risk when the ship is sinking and you're about to lose everything in 36 months. So I would say, with regard to Bitcoin is an interesting, nice to have, and an intellectual discussion for people in Western Europe and the US and the developed world with a strong currency losing 7% of its value a year. But Bitcoin represents a life raft to the billions of people in Sri Lanka and Lebanon and Turkey and Argentina and Venezuela, not to mention the ones in Cuba and North Korea that have zero property rights. I mean, the king of fiat currencies is the US dollar. It's the world reserve currency. Right? There's about 180 currencies total. Any currency backed by a nation state And of course, the nation state has the ability to decide exactly what the supply is and what the interest rates will be, and they do and they will manipulate it to their own benefit. So I can imagine getting some real colorful knockdown, drag-out debates with the cyber hornets over the Bitcoin standard on Twitter. And George and Doomberg, just to be clear, I too am afraid of the cyber hornets. They will shred anybody if you get on their wrong side. So you have to respect the hornets. But my view on this entire issue is Bitcoin is about 0.1% of the liquid financial assets circulating around the world right now, like $300 to $400 billion out of a $400 trillion number. If it got 10 times bigger, it would be 1%. If it got 100 times bigger, it would be 10%. So in our lifetime, in the next 10 to 30 years, I don't think the entire world is going to be revolving around Bitcoin. I think that what you'll see is Bitcoin is a reserve asset that can replace gold and can replace land and can replace portfolios of stocks as a long-term treasury asset. What portion of your monetary assets are sitting in dollars? What portion is sitting in pesos or bolivar? And what portion is sitting in a liquid treasury reserve asset like Bitcoin? And then what portion of your wealth would you have invested in buildings and stocks and collectibles and derivatives and bonds? And the answer to that is different for everybody, depending upon how much money they have and where they reside in their citizenship. And also whether you're a corporate entity or you're a family or an individual is different. I think that you get yourself in trouble if you start imagining just a world where Bitcoin is the only asset, and debt goes away and currencies go away. Now you just get into some very interesting hypothetical situations, but I don't really care to promote them or debate them because I just don't think it's constructive for the next 30 years. I don't promote securities and currencies because my view is the safest ethical ground to stand on is to promote a commodity without an issuer, right? I don't promote them, but I understand there's 10,000 securities you might invest in, and you can make mistakes or you can make a lot of money on them. And I don't dismiss the value of Google stock. I don't think that Bitcoin is a currency. As long as the United States exists, stuff's going to be denominated in the US dollar.
Okay.
I see it as property. My view is Bitcoin is demonetizing gold. The reason that gold is only 100x as valuable over 90 years and property is 500x more valuable is because property is actually being monetized. Gold is being demonetized. So Bitcoin is going to demonetize that second investment home. It's going to demonetize gold. It's going to demonetize maybe ETFs and some stocks. But and ultimately, maybe it's going to demonetize some bonds. But it's going to be a long process. It's going to take a couple of decades, 3 decades. And then if you want to get rich, you have to own property. And so Bitcoin is property that the middle class and working class people can own everywhere in the world. And otherwise, they're going to be destitute. So Bitcoin is a solution to the individual and the corporation. I think that it's idealistic to think that somehow all of the world's problems get solved in the next decade with Bitcoin. That's not true. But what is true is that if you're about to become poor and starve to death in the middle of a country where the currency is collapsing, it'll solve your problem. It solves the problem of people in Lebanon or Turkey or Argentina or Venezuela. It solves their problem. And if you're a middle-class person driving an Uber in the United States, you can't very well buy an 18th of a building. So it gives you property rights. You can buy a piece of property and you can save for your retirement using that property and not rely upon a third party, right? So it is a particular solution to a set of problems that individuals face. That's why we promote it. The way we would say it would be under a fiat standard, you're building the economy on a crumbling, corrupt credit system where the value is draining from society's, it's draining into society's goods, making them more expensive because the currency is demonetizing. And under a Bitcoin standard, you're building on a sound, virtuous money and the value is draining into society's money, making the goods less expensive. And that's true. It's just going to take 30 years. I mean, it's a lot. Again, coming back to this, if Bitcoin became, went from 400 billion to 4 trillion to 40 trillion, when it gets to 40 trillion, 100x from where it is right now, it's starting to put material pressure on a bond market, which at that point will be $200 trillion, right? So you're still only chewing into 10, 20, 30% of the bond market. Now, how fast we get there, it's probably 20, 30 years. We're not going to have a jolting revolt or a revolution in the economic system. That's not good for anybody, right? I mean, that happened in the Soviet Union and in Cuba, and we know, and North Korea, know how that ends. That's not good. What you want is a gentle progression, or a progression from a fiat system that's crumbling on corrupt credit. You want to progress from that system to sound money, and Bitcoin represents integrity, sound money. And if it took 30 to 50 years to get there, that's probably the most peaceful, least violent, most constructive way to get there. I can't see us rebuilding the entire economy in a matter of a couple of years. When we talk about Bitcoin standard, I think a family, an individual, or a company can adopt a Bitcoin standard. I don't think we're anywhere close to a nation state adopting a Bitcoin standard. And what it really refers to normally is people focus upon accumulating and storing their wealth in sound money, and they view the Bitcoin as the soundest money. I just say don't poke the Bitcoiners unnecessarily. Look, if you have $1 million and you have a choice to give it to the federal government by buying $1 million 30-year T-bill and accepting 3% interest for the rest of your life, or buy $1 million worth of Bitcoin, it seems to me that if you believe in sound money and limited government, you're better off to spend $1 million on Bitcoin than spend $1 million on 30-year U.S. sovereign debt. That's their only point, right? The reason they're in favor of Bitcoin standard is they think that in a world where the Chinese government puts $1 trillion of real financial wealth into the U.S. dollar, that just empowers the Federal Reserve to push $200 billion a year worth of more inflation out there, or 100 billion more. And so as the money flows from sovereign debt and currency, you're making a technical point, but at the end of the day, the solution to the problem is take your money and move it outside of the fiat currency system. Don't put it, because it's a zero-sum game. It's either in the system or out of the system.